potentate. This is the word monarch. It's pointing towards one leader, one person who occupies the position of leadership. Solomon deals primarily in the last and final section of the book of Proverbs. He deals with monarchical issues. He's speaking to those who lead, those that are in leadership, and those who are leaders. The wise man Solomon in chapter 27, of course, is speaking to two primary audiences. He's speaking to two specific groups of people. He's speaking, number one, to his sons. He's speaking to his biological sons. And he's speaking also not only to his biological sons, he's speaking to his governmental subjects, those in which Solomon governs. He's speaking to his subjects. So in chapter 27, the wise man Solomon is speaking primarily to his sons, and he's speaking to his subjects, and he's speaking to us as students of the book of Proverbs. So there are three audiences listening to the voice and the wisdom of Solomon. That's his sons, that's his subjects, and even to us as students of the book of Proverbs. Now, something else we should keep in mind as we study the 27th chapter of the book of Proverbs. The wise man Solomon is speaking to three groups of people, really: his sons, his subjects, and he's speaking to us as students of the book of Proverbs. But one thing that comes through with crystal clarity is the fact that he's advising us by extending to us all a stern warning. Throughout chapters 25, 26, and 27, Solomon chose to advise us through a stern warning. A stern warning. He's saying to us, beware, be aware. In the 27th chapter of the book of Proverbs, he's telling us to beware, be aware of how we behave ourselves, how we behave ourselves, how we behave ourselves. Solomon is interested in equipping us to be able to behave ourselves in regard to certain situations and circumstances that may come to us in life. And the first issue he was concerned about in us being able to behave ourselves is when it comes to our glaring faults. Our glaring faults. In chapter 27, beginning with verse 1 and ending with verse 4, Solomon deals with our glaring faults. He deals with his sons' glaring faults. He deals with his subjects' glaring faults. And he deals with our, as students, glaring faults. And of course, the word glaring literally means that which is obvious, that which is plainly seen, that which is clearly seen. You and I have some glaring faults, some obvious faults. And Solomon wants to make sure, as students of the book of Proverbs, he wants to make sure that you and I are equipped to know how to behave in regard to our glaring faults. Verses 1 through 4 deals primarily with our glaring faults. Then he transitions, and when I speak of transitioning, I'm talking about Solomon will purposefully and purposely change by start talking about one thing to start talking about another thing. So here, Solomon in verse 5, Solomon transitions from talking about our glaring faults to talk about our so called good friends. he now talks about our so called good friends. I say so called because friends need to prove themselves as our friends. Because Solomon says in the long ago for the here and now, if you want to be a friend, if you want friends, you must first show yourself to be friendly. You can't have the personality of a porcupine and then wonder why you don't have any friends. You have to first prove yourself friendly in order to secure so called good friends. The wise man Solomon speaks to us in verses 5 through 10. He speaks to us about our so-called good friends. Then he transitions once again in verse number 11 and talks about glad fathers. Glad fathers. The verse number 11 primarily deals with how to make fathers glad. So Solomon speaks to us in verse 11 about glad fathers, glad fathers. Then from verses 17, from verses 17 um, um, to pardon me, from verses 12 through 16, 12 through 16, Solomon speaks about great folly, great folly. And of course, we've defined the word folly as um, the height of foolishness. He's talking about great foolishness when he speaks about great folly. In verses 12 through 16, uh, Solomon speaks about great folly. Then he closes chapter 27 with telling us that we need to learn how to behave in regard to growing finances. Growing finances. That's what Solomon talks about in verses 12 through the end of chapter 27, which ends in verse 27. Notice, if you will, Solomon's major focus in verses 17 through 22. Listen carefully. From verses 17 to 22, Solomon focuses in on integrity. Integrity. We took our time last week to share with you the importance of having integrity. If you are serious, if you are sincere about growing your finances, the first order of business is that you have to have a degree of integrity. Of integrity. And of course, we define the word integrity as doing the right thing in the right way consistently. That's how you show you have integrity, by doing the right thing in the right way consistently. When you do the right thing and you do it in the right way consistently, we call that integrity. Integrity. So, Solomon is focusing in on the importance of integrity. When he shares with us how to behave when it comes to financial matters, Solomon says the first order of business is that all of us have to have a degree of integrity. We must be willing to do the right thing in the right way consistently. Consistently. Solomon is also focusing in not on integrity under how to behave in regard to growing finances. He transitions in verse 23 from talking about integrity to speak to us about in industry. 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 He goes from integrity to industry, industry, being industrious, if you will, being industrious, if you will. And being industrious requires hard work. no doubt about it, it requires hard work. Not only does it require hard work, it requires the determination to finish a task. Indus- Industry requires that we are determined to finish a task and to finish that task well. Not just finish to be finished, but you are determined to finish the task and you are determined to finish the task, complete the task well. Well, that's what industry means. On last Wednesday evening, beloved, we concluded our study in verse number 22. In verse number 22, which puts us at the doorstep of verse 23. Now, verse 23 will serve as the verse where we will formally begin our study for this evening, and we'll complete our study prayerfully in verse 27, and we would have completed our study of chapter 27. In chapter 27 ends in verse 27. In verse 27. So in verse number 23, this is where we will formally begin our study for this evening. Beloved, we must keep in mind that Solomon, listen carefully, that Solomon is writing from a particular and a specific viewpoint. I'm going to say that again. In the writing of verse 23, Proverb 23, Solomon is writing from a particular and he's writing from a specific viewpoint. There are two perspectives from which Solomon is writing as I studied the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, and specifically verse 23. Solomon shares with us two viewpoints. Two viewpoints. The first viewpoint Solomon writes from and pens this proverb from is that of a son of a caring shepherd. You have to remember that Solomon's dad was King David. King David started out as a shepherd. He was a shepherd boy. Matter of fact, not only was he a shepherd boy, long before he became king and shepherded God's people, he was a shepherd of sheep. So Solomon writes to us from the perspective of being the son of a caring shepherd. Don't miss this. From a caring shepherd. He's the son of a caring shepherd. So he writes from that perspective in chapter 27, verse 23, all the way to verse 27. Now, not only does he share with us his perspective as the son of a caring shepherd, but he also shares with us that he is the son of a king. He was the son of king. He not only was he the son of a shepherd, he was the son of a king. His dad, David, was the king of Israel. Matter of fact, his dad had bragging points because under the leadership of his father David, the people of Israel became united. He was king over all of Israel. All 12 tribes fell under the leadership of King David. So Solomon writes this particular proverb from the viewpoint of being the son of a shepherd and also being the son of the king or the son of a king. And he becomes a king himself because of his father David. His father David was first king and passed the leadership role over to his son Solomon. So Solomon writes to us, he writes for us from these two viewpoints. He's the son of a shepherd, and he writes to us from the perspective of being the son of a king, although being a king himself, a king himself. Let's read verse 23 to see if we can identify these two viewpoints. Now, the first viewpoint that Solomon writes from um, in verse 23 is that he was the son of a shepherd. Verse 23, its writing shows the viewpoint that Solomon is the son of a shepherd. Listen carefully. In verse 23, the Bible says, "Be thou diligent." Beloved, if you own the Bible in which you're reading, please circle the word diligent, because Solomon is going to share with us the importance of being diligent, and he's going to show us the danger when we are not diligent. This is a key word to understanding verses 23 through 27, is that we have to get a handle on this word diligent. Listen to Solomon. Solomon says, "Be thou diligent. Be thou diligent." Thou diligence for what? To know the state of thy flocks, the condition of thy flocks, and look well, attend well thy herds, thy herds. So listen to Solomon once again for emphasis. Be thou diligent. That's the key to understanding this verse and the following verses. Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds. And look well to our herds. Beloved, anybody that knows anything about sheep fully understands and appreciates this statement. Sheep, or flocks of sheep, demand great care. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Sheep, or flocks of sheep, demand great care, great concern, great attention, if you will. And I believe that when he says, "Be thou diligent," he's speaking from the perspective, the viewpoint of being the son of a shepherd. Because a shepherd, if anything, has to be attentive. He has to be watchful. He has to be diligent, if you will. Why? Because sheep um, readily stray. That's the nature of sheep, to stray, and once they stray, they're easily lost. They can be in eyeshot of where the flock is and not even know that the flock is within eye shot, and they become easily lost. Easily lost. Not only do they become easily lost, but one of the characteristics of sheep is that they have no natural defenses. They have no natural defenses. You're not getting this. Let me share with you what I'm talking about. A lion's natural defense is he can roar, and he frightens his prey. He frightens his enemies through his roar. So a lion has a roar as a defense mechanism. Even a cat can scratch his way out of trouble. Okay, a dog can bark their way out of trouble. A tiger and can bite his way out of trouble. Even a skunk can stink his way out of trouble. But the sheep has no natural defense. That's why every sheep needs a shepherd. Y'all missed that. Every sheep needs a shepherd, because they easily stray, they easily lose their way, and they have no defense mechanism, no natural defense mechanism. That's why sheep need a shepherd. Every sheep need a shepherd. We are the sheep of his pasture. Y'all not getting this. We are the sheep of his pasture. And every sheep needs a shepherd. And therefore, that's why David declared in the long ago for the here and now, every sheep needs a shepherd. And David said, the Lord is my shepherd, and we are the sheep of his pasture. So here, Solomon is speaking from the perspective of being the son of a shepherd. He's telling us, he's warning us, he's giving us a stern warning that we must be diligent when it comes to dealing with financial matters. That's what Solomon is trying to say to us. We will never see our financial situation grow if we fail to be diligent. Now, remember, Solomon is speaking from the perspective of being the son of a shepherd. And a shepherd has to be watchful. A shepherd has to be attentive. A shepherd has to be hard working because he or she must be diligent in order to protect their sheep and their flock. That's why every sheep needs a shepherd, because they easily stray, they easily lose their way, and they have no natural uh, defense mechanism. And another thing, sheep are not swift, they're not fast, they're not swift, they're not strong, and they're not smart. Yeah, they're really dumb. Sheep are really dumb. And that even describes us. That's why we need a shepherd. Why do we need a shepherd? Because we ain't swift, we ain't swift, we ain't swift, we ain't strong, and we are definitely not smart when it comes to the ways of the world. That's why we need God's wisdom to help guide us and guard us through our daily activities. And I want you to keep in mind here that I discovered through study also um, one of the characteristics of a sheep is that a sheep cannot naturally clean itself. God Almighty, that is sure enough an insight. They cannot naturally clean themselves, so they easily become dirty. They easily hold on to all kinds of matter in their wool, and it causes infection. Infection, and when it causes infection, it is easily passed on to another sheep because whatever illnesses and diseases they contract, they are contagious. They are highly contagious to other sheep. Isn't that just like us? When we are knee deep in sin, sin becomes contagious, and whatever sinful illnesses and diseases our soul catch, they are easily passed on to someone else. That's why every sheep needs a what? Every sheep needs a shepherd, because sheep cannot easily clean themselves. That's why David said that he leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. And he takes us by the still waters. Why does the water have to be still? The Bible is very specific. It does not, the shepherd does not lead them to water, he leads them to still water. Well, sheep are naturally afraid of running water because they know intuitively that if they fall in the water will be soaked up by their wool, and their wool will soak up so much water that it will cause them to drown, to drown. So that's why you'll never see sheep standing by rushing waters or running water. That's why sheep need a shepherd, because in order for them to feel safe around water, the shepherd has to dam up the waters on both sides, so when the sheep approaches, he does not approach rushing, running water, he approaches still water. Teach, Pastor. I'm doing the best that I can. Listen to me carefully. So the sheep approaches the still water, and the sheep bathes themselves, bathe themselves, and they drink the water because why? Sheep cannot naturally clean themselves. They have to be cleaned by the shepherd. They have to be cleaned up by the shepherd because sheep do not naturally clean themselves. Not only that, they are they are easily affected, they are easily infected by illnesses and diseases. That's why the sheep need a shepherd to identify any illnesses or diseases, because if the illness and disease hang around, it's highly contagious, and instead of having one sheep sick, you'll have one flock of sheep sick. That's why sheep needs a shepherd. Now, in verse 23, remember, in verse 23, that Solomon is writing this text, he's writing this proverb uh, from the uh, from the world of agriculture. The world of agriculture. At the time of our writing, Israel was an agricultural society. They were highly agricultural in their daily lives. In other words, they dealt every day with flocks. They dealt with herds, lambs and goats. That's why Solomon speaks of grass and hay, because during the time of the writing, Solomon lived in a highly agricultural society. We live in a highly technical society, but Solomon lived in a highly agricultural society, dealing with flocks and herds, goats and lambs, hay and grass. That's why he uses these terms in verses 25, 26, and even in verse 27, because he's speaking from an agricultural perspective. Now, but it's not the herds, it's not the goats, it's not the lambs, it's not the hay, it's not the grass. That's not what we want to focus on. What we want to focus in on the principle found within this agricultural society. Solomon is sharing with us not only his agricultural society, that is a principle found behind the way he dealt in this agricultural society. And if we look at the principle, we will discover that it will help us deal in this highly technical society. Teach, Pastor. I'm doing the best that I can. It's the principle behind verses 23 through 27 that we're looking for to help us deal in this highly technical society in which we live. Now, of course, a principle, remember, do remember what a principle is? A principle is something that will work for anyone. It'll work for anyone, anywhere. It'll work anywhere, anytime, and it works all the time. We're looking for the principle that will work for anyone. It'll work anywhere, it'll work anytime, and it works all the time. What is the principle behind Solomon sharing with us about herds and flocks and goats and lambs? What's the principle? I believe I've identified not all, but some of the principles that Solomon wants to share with us as we study these particular uh, verses. Now, we are the first principle and the major principle that Solomon wants to get to us and gets through us to us and get through us um, is the fact that we must be diligent. Did you hear what I said? Solomon says, in all things, the main thing is to be diligent. To be diligent. And we're going to unpack that word because that is a key word, a key phrase to understanding verses 23 through 27. But this is an important word in the eyesight of Solomon, that in all things we must be what? We must be diligent. In being diligent, we must work hard. We must work hard. Being diligent requires hard work. We have to be hard at work if we're going to be diligent. But not only does it mean hard work, it means to be watchful. It means to be attentive. And we must be attentive to that which we are watching. And we must work hard at what? Being diligent, being watchful, being attentive, if you will. And Solomon becomes specific about what we need to be diligent about. We need to be diligent, um, knowing the state. Listen at what he says in verse 23. Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks. Know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds. Be attentive to thy flocks, and be attentive to thy herds. What is Solomon trying to say to us? He's not trying to make us all farmers. That's not his aim here. But you do realize that farming, Solomon came from an agricultural society. Now we come from a what? Highly technical society. But we still, whether you live in an agricultural society or a technical society, we still need to be attentive. We need to be watchful. We need to be hard at work when it comes to our personal business. We need to be up to date on the condition, on the state of our personal affairs. That's what Solomon is said. Don't leave it to other people. Don't delegate your understanding of the state and condition of your personal affairs to others. That's something you must do. You must get it firsthand. Don't get it second hand, third hand, fourth hand. You must know firsthand the condition, where you are financially, where you are financially. He says, don't leave it to other people to tell you where you are. You need to know where you are financially for yourself. That's something that should not be solely dedicated to someone else. Solomon says, if you're wise, you must be diligent. You must be watchful. You must be attentive when it comes to knowing the state, the condition of your personal affairs. Now, if you don't know firsthand, whatever God has given us to manage, whatever God has given us to be stewards over, you need to know the state, the condition of those things that God has left in your charge. Yeah, God has left in your charge. Because if you don't know the present condition, listen carefully, if you don't know the present condition of something, you can't effectively manage it. Yeah, you can't manage it, you can't lead it if you don't know what its condition is, its state is. Am I making this clear? You have to know that kind of information firsthand. So Solomon is saying, don't delegate your personal affairs solely to someone else. You have to know within the confines of your own mind what the state, what the condition of your financial affairs really are, really, really are. So here, Solomon is advising us here the importance of first hand knowledge. That's the principle I believe Solomon is trying to leave us with here in verse number 23 is that the importance of first hand knowledge. Don't put your personal affairs, don't put your personal welfare in the hands of someone else solely. Now, I'm sure that there are times when we can delegate other people to help us with our financial affairs, but Solomon is not talking about that. He's talking about as someone else doing it all for you, and you don't have first-hand knowledge of your state or the condition of your financial affairs. So here Solomon says that you must be diligent when it comes to your personal affairs. He uses herds and flocks because that's the stuff that made him rich. That's the stuff that made him wealthy. He had a lot of flocks, he had a lot of herds, he had herds of camels, and he had all kind of livestock. But according to Solomon, he had many servants, but he didn't delegate their welfare solely to his servants. Solomon was wise enough to know that he needed first-hand knowledge. He needed hands-on activity to know exactly the wealth that he had, and in order to maintain his wealth, he needed to know diligently the state and the condition of his personal affairs. That's all Solomon is trying to tell us, that we need first-hand knowledge of our personal affairs, whether it be financial, whether it be we need to know the state and condition of our health. You can't leave that to somebody else. You need to know firsthand. So Solomon is sharing with us the importance of firsthand information, firsthand involvement in our affairs, whether it be financial, whether it be medical or medicinal, whatever it may be that concerns us, we need first hand knowledge. That's what Solomon is saying here. Make sure you know for yourself. Make sure you know within yourself the state or the condition of your personal affairs. Solomon seems to share with us from firsthand experience. Again, he had a lot of servants, he had a lot of employees, if you will, but Solomon didn't leave the state of his wealth or the state of his personal affairs to other people. He had firsthand knowledge of how he was doing personally because he was very diligent when it came to his personal affairs. So here Solomon gives us a stern warning of what happens. Here it is. Here it is. Write this down. In verses 23 and 25, Solomon is focusing in on this point. Solomon is warning us. Solomon is warning us in verse 23, verse 24. Solomon is warning us of what happens when one gives up being diligent. That's what verses 23 and 24 are all about. He's showing with us, he's sharing with us what happens when one gives up being diligent, being diligent, being diligent. And again, being diligent requires hard work. Being diligent requires that we are hard at work. Being diligent means that we are watchful. It means that we are attentive. It means to be active, to be fully engaged with. It also means persistent effort. Persistent effort. You can't be diligent if you're not willing to put in persistent effort. Persistent effort, showing great care or showing great attention to. So here Solomon says that we have to be diligent. And if we're going to be diligent, we have to be watchful, we have to be attentive, we have to be hard at work, we have to be fully engaged, we have to be persistent in our efforts, and we have to show great care and great concern if one is sincere and serious about being diligent. The warning is introduced in verse 23, but it's illustrated in verse 24. Did you hear what I just said? Yeah. Now, what is he sharing with us? What is he showing us? He's trying to show us in no uncertain terms what happens when one gives up being diligent. That's the banner that this verse falls under. What happens to when one gives up being diligent? And the subject is introduced in verse 23, and he illustrates the verse in verse 24. I'm going to say it again. Under the banner of what happens, that's what Solomon is doing in verses 23 and 24. He's sharing with us what happens when one gives up being diligent, one gives up being watchful, one gives up being attentive, one gives up being fully engaged, persistent in effort, not able to show care or concern. This is what happens. He introduces the subject of what happens when one gives up being diligent, and then he illustrates it in verse 24. He illustrates it in verse 24. But 23 shares with us Solomon's perspective from the critical viewpoint of being the son of a shepherd, He says that it's required of us that we be diligent. You can read it for yourself right here in verse number 23. Be thou diligent to know firsthand the state of thy flocks and look well to thy herds. That's verse 23. Verse 23. Now, remember, the wise man Solomon is sharing with us his personal viewpoint from being the son of a shepherd. That's why he says to us immediately in verse 23, be diligent, be watchful, be attentive, be fully engaged, show care, show concern, be fully engaged and persistent in your efforts when in regard to your personal affairs. Am I getting through to you what Solomon is trying to do here in verse 23? Well, let's go now then to verse 24. Because here Solomon is sharing with us the viewpoint no longer of the son of a shepherd, but now he's sharing with us his viewpoint as a king, as a king, as a king. Now you remember Solomon was the wisest man on earth. He's the wisest man that ever lived, save Jesus the Christ. Now, he is a wise man. He's one of the wisest men that ever lived. Remember this. But he also was the king of Israel. He was the king of Israel, and being the king of Israel, God enriched him with riches and wealth untold. No one was as rich as Solomon. No one was as wealthy as Solomon. Solomon was wealthy. He was the king. He had full of riches and wealth, and we have to keep in mind that he didn't become wealthy, and he didn't maintain his wealth. He was able to do it because he was diligent when it came to his personal affairs. Solomon was diligent. That's what he's sharing with us, that when it comes to our personal affairs, We've got to be what, beloved? We have to be diligent. We have to be diligent. Because even the most prosperous shepherd can easily lose his wealth when he fails to be what? Diligent. When he fails to be diligent. If you fail to be diligent and become neglectful, then you are on the road to lose your wealth and to lose your flock, to lose your riches, because wealth and riches don't last always. That's what Solomon says in verse 24. For riches are not forever. Ain't that the truth? For riches are not forever. You can understand that. I can understand that. Going through this epidemic that's gone pandemic, the stock market went down. One day our 401ks were up here, and the next day they were down here because the stock market took a big hit because of the lack of activity because of COVID 19 at the time, COVID 19 at the time. And this is proof positive that riches are not forever. What you have is not promised to last forever. We can easily lose the little bit we have. It can easily be lost, and it can be lost especially if we give up being diligent. That's what Solomon is trying to tell us. If we give up being diligent, we have so much to lose when we willfully give up being diligent, being watchful, being attentive, being fully engaged. So here, Solomon is sharing with us in no uncertain terms, don't give up being diligent, because he introduces the subject of being diligent in verse 23, and then he illustrates his point in verse 24. Let's look again at verse 24. For riches are not forever, and doth the crown endure to every generation. Let's unpack this. This is powerful. This is powerful right here. Solomon says in verse 23, Solomon says we have to be diligent. We have to be diligent. We have to be watchful. We have to be careful. We have to be attentive. We have to be fully engaged. Why? He spoke those words from the perspective of being the son of a shepherd, because he knows fully well that if a shepherd is anything, a shepherd has to be watchful. A shepherd has to be attentive. A shepherd has to be fully engaged. That's what Solomon is trying to tell us. Now, in verse 24, he no longer speaks to us from the perspective of a son of a caring shepherd. He speaks to us from his experience of being a king, and not only being a king, but having riches and wealth untold. Now he speaks to us from his personal experience of his personal wealth and riches. He says in verse 24, he says to us, for riches are not forever. Ain't that the truth? And doth the crown endure to every generation. Now, who is Solomon speaking to? He's speaking to his sons, he's speaking to his subjects, and he's speaking to us as students of the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs. Now, Solomon shares with us from the perspective of being the king, full of riches and wealth. He says to us that riches and wealth are not guaranteed tomorrow, because they don't last forever. Why? Especially if we become neglectful in our personal affairs, in regard to our personal wealth, you can easily lose what you already um, have, especially if one becomes lazy or one takes for granted um, their financial wealth and their financial riches. We can't afford to become lazy when it becomes in regard to being diligent over our personal affairs. We can't afford to 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 be to take for granted the riches and wealth that we have today, and take it for granted that we'll have it tomorrow and we'll have it next day, day after that, day after that. No, Solomon says he snaps us into reality. He says riches and wealth will not last forever, especially if you give up being diligent, especially if you give up being diligent and become neglectful in regard to your personal affairs and your personal financial affairs, if you will. And never take for granted that just because you have what you have today, that you'll have it tomorrow and the next day and the next day. No, 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 no. You have to remember what James told us. James told us that tomorrow is not promised, and we don't know what can happen in just one day. In just one day. If you don't believe me, ask Job. It took one day. He was on top of the world one day. But then by evening time, he felt like the world was on top of him because he lost everything he had in just one day. In just one day. So we can't take for granted that we'll have what we have always, because riches and wealth will not, cannot, must not last forever. Keep that in mind as you are diligently managing your personal affairs. Yeah, that's why we have to save up for a rainy day, because we fully realize that riches and wealth are not promised to last forever. How am I doing, church? Don't last forever. That's why we need to put something aside. We can't afford to spend up everything we bring in, because there will come a time when we will lose our wealth, we'll lose our riches, and we need to be in a place that we are wise in regard to our personal affairs. At least that's what the wise man Solomon is sharing with us in verse 23 and in verse 24. Now, I want you to look quickly at the B section, the B section, at the B section of verse number 24. The B section of verse 24. The A section of verse 24 is, for riches are not forever. Now, then the B section begins by saying, doth the crown endure to every generation? That's a key question. That's a key question. Remember now in verse 24, he's illustrating what happens when one gives up being diligent. Being diligent. That's what Solomon's doing in verse 24. You remember in verse 23, he introduces what happens when one gives up being diligent. Now, in verse 24, where we are now, he's trying to illustrate to us what happens when one gives up being diligent. And he shares with us, he begins the B section of verse 24 with what is grammatically called a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question. What is a rhetorical question? Rhetorical is a $5 word that means when you ask a rhetorical question, you are asking a question you already know the answer to. Yeah, yeah. You're not asking the question for information. You're asking the question to inform, not to get information, but to give information. Rhetorical question is when you ask a question you already know the answer to. And Solomon here introduces us to what happens when one gives up being diligent. He asks the question in the B section of verse 24. He says, and doth the crown endure to every generation? Solomon already knew the answer to that. No, 10,000 times no. Now, just because you are king today doesn't mean your sons uh, and daughters will be queen or king tomorrow. Tomorrow. So Solomon fully understands, just like he understood the fact that riches and wealth won't last forever, no more than the crown. The crown is guaranteed to the next generation because of change and the changes of life. They're swift, uh, they often come without warning. So Solomon says, be wise, be wise. Just understand the fact that riches won't last forever, no more than my crown is guaranteed to my sons or my daughters, if you will. My sons will not automatically become king because of change. Change. And remember, change is swift and oftentimes comes without warning. Sickness comes upon us swiftly and without warning. We lose our financial grip swiftly and without warning. Without warning. That's what Solomon is trying to show us here. And he illustrates it by asking a rhetorical question, question in verse number 24 in the B section, specifically of verse number 24. Solomon asks the question. He already knows the answer, and the answer is no. The answer is no. There is no guarantee, according to verse number 24 in the B section of verse 24. And doth the crown endure to every, that's the key word in that phrase, to every generation. Every generation. No, it does not. So Solomon already knew the answer to that, but he wants to inform us of what happens when we give up being what? Diligent. We give up being diligent, diligent, if you will. Now, I want to show you something. Anybody that is a student of history knows that what Solomon just said is absolutely positively true. Positively true. Because during the time of our writing, Solomon was well aware of the fact that royal dynasties changed frequently. Did you hear what I said? The wise man Solomon wisely knew and foreknew that royal dynasties changed frequently. Changed frequently. Frequently. And anyone who's familiar with history, especially biblical history, in Solomon's case, this word affected Solomon directly. Because you remember when he died, Jeroboam snatched 10 tribes from his son, who he was trying to impress upon to be diligent, and he failed in his impressions because Rehoboam allowed Jeroboam to snatch 10 tribes from him. And therefore, Jeroboam immediately became king of 10 tribes and left Rehoboam with 2 tribes. And the 2 tribes that Rehoboam was left with was Benjamin and the tribe of Judah. Jeroboam has snatched the other 10 tribes from Rehoboam. In spite of Solomon's frequent instruction and his stern warning, his own son was no longer king over the 12 tribes of Israel. His son became the king of 2 tribes in Israel. So that's why it's important for us to understand the importance of what? Diligence. of diligence. I'm going to bring this to a close, but you remember that we went offline for a few minutes, so I got a couple more minutes, and then the lesson will be yours. The lesson will be yours. Remember now um, that that um, um, that the wise man Solomon gives us two perspectives. Two perspectives. One, the first perspective is that of the son of a shepherd, the son of a shepherd. Then the second, found in verse 24, he gives us the perspective of a king of great wealth and great riches. Now, remember, he introduces to us in verse 23 what happens. What happens when? What happens what? What happens when one gives up being diligent? He introduces this in verse 23, and then he illustrates it for us in verse 24. Verse 24. Now, in verse 25, Solomon shows us with crystal clarity what happens when one goes on being diligent. Verse 23 and 24 gives up being diligent. But what happens when one goes on being diligent? He shares that with us in verse 25. Teach, Pastor. In verse 25, he's telling us what happens when one goes on, when one consistently becomes diligent. Becomes diligent. Now, here's how Solomon shows us. Here's how Solomon illustrates to us what happens when one goes on being diligent. He says, look at three things. Look at three things that belong to those who are diligent. So he tells us first in verse 25 to look at the fields of the diligent. Yeah, look at the fields of the diligent. Just don't look at fields. I want you to take a good look, a clear look at the fields of people who are diligent, who are diligent. Then he says, after we look at the fields of the diligent, he says, I want you to look at the farms of the diligent. Look and see what the farms of the diligent look like. So you have an example, a clear example of what the farms of the diligent looks like, and compare it to what you have. If you are diligent, your farm should look like this. If you are diligent, your field should look like this. And then he closes in verse 27 telling us to look at the food the diligent eat. Look at the food the diligent eat. Yeah, your table should look like this if you are being diligent. If you're being diligent. So he first tells us, verse 25, look at the fields of the diligent. Let's look at the fields of the diligent. The hay appeareth, then the tender grass showeth itself, and the herbs of the mountains are gathered. All Solomon is doing is sharing with us uh, uh, the fields of the diligent. All he's sharing with us and defining and describing for us is seed time and harvest. Just not seed time and harvest, a successful seeding and a successful harvest. A successful seeding and successful harvest. What does a successful harvest, what does successful seeding look like? It begins with the fact, verse 25, he says, the hay appeareth. The hay just doesn't appear. It appears at harvest time. Don't miss this. It appears specifically at harvest times, but it could not appear at all if it was not seeded on time. And if you want an on-time harvest, you have to have on-time seeding. Because in Genesis chapter 1, you remember he says harvest follows seed times follows harvest. If you don't have a seed, if you don't invest, if you don't plant that seed, you'll never have a harvest. Many of us walk around talking about, I'm waiting for my ship to come in. Well, you'll never have a ship to come in if you never send a ship out. Come on, let's be real. Let's keep it real. How can you expect a ship to come in if you never send a ship out? How can you expect to have a harvest if you neglected seed time? So, what Solomon is trying to show us is that those who are diligent, um, um, you will have successful seeding and successful harvest time. Because he says in verse 25, again, the hay appeareth, the tender grass then shows itself, and the herbs of the mountains are gathered. When does the hay appear? Harvest time. When does the new grass come up? Harvest time. After you cut the hay, you cut it down to the grass, and new grass will show itself. And listen, that's the time that the herbs found on the mountain are to be harvested. And because there's herbs, because there's hay, because there's new grass, then the diligent have to do the harvesting at the time of harvesting. So here he says that the diligent experience seeding and harvest time, and the diligent get busy doing seeding and harvest time. You have to fertilize the seed. You have to water the seed in order for the seed to take hold of the nutrients found in the earth, and then for the harvest to grow to the ability to harvest the harvest. Then the diligent get busy in harvesting the herbs, harvesting the hay, harvesting the hay. So here we see a picture perfect field of the diligent. The diligent recognize that when the hay appears, when the herbs are on the mountain, that's the time to harvest. And he's merely showing us what a successful seeding and a successful harvest looks like when the person that owns the field is diligent, is diligent. Then he says, not only look at the fields of the diligent, I dare you to take a good look at the farms of the diligent. The farms of the diligent. I'm finding that in verse 26. The lambs are for thy clothing, and the goats are the price of the fields. Now, the diligent, when it comes to farming, many of the people of Solomon's day had lambs and goats. Lambs and goats. Matter of fact, how wealthy you were dependent upon how many camels you had, how many lambs you had, how many goats you had, because they were living in an agricultural society. So you had to have uh, lambs, you had to have goats, if you will, and they were successful farmers. And Solomon says that on the in the fields and on the farms of the diligent you will discover many sheep and many goats. Now, what is the importance of having many lambs? Well, Solomon says it right here. For the diligent, having many lambs ensure that you will have proper clothing, because the wool of the lambs were used to protect them from the winter, and the sheep's clothing, the sheep's wool would ensure that they had proper clothing. So So the sheep's wool was made specifically, primarily for coats and for clothing. As the um, having many sheep ensured that you didn't have to worry about having coats and clothing for your family, for your family. So when you look at the farm of the diligent, they had many sheep. And because they had many sheep, they ensured the fact that they would have coats for the winter and clothes for the summer. Clothes for the summer. So when we look at the fields of the fields of the diligent are full because they diligently work from seed time to harvest. When we look at the farms of the diligent, they have many sheep. And because they have many sheep, what? They have coats and they are insured of proper clothing in the summer. Then the Bible says that goats are the price of the field. Not only look at the sheep they have, the lambs they have, look, see how many goats they have. Now, the goats, you have to remember that Solomon lived in an agricultural society and they did not exchange money. They did not exchange dollar bills. We do that today, but that's not how they did business in Solomon's day. How they did business in Solomon's day. Listen carefully. They would barter. What they would barter. That's what they would do. They would barter. What is barter? To barter means that you fairly exchange goods for services and services for goods. Y'all not getting it. You make an exchange for what you need. Yeah, and if you need goods or if you needed services, then you will exchange one thing for another thing. You exchange one thing for another thing. So here, Solomon says you can exchange goats for almost everything, and you can increase your wealth based upon how many goats you have, because goats far exceeded their value because there's so much you can do with a goat. Number one, and then he'll illustrate it in verse 27. He says, first thing is that if you have a whole lot of goats, if you've been diligent in farming your goats, then you will be insured of milk, because goat's milk during the time of our writing was more nutritious than cow's milk. So if you had goat milk, you wanted goat milk over cow milk because goat milk was more nutritious and more lasting than cow's milk. You could preserve goat milk better than you could preserve cow's milk during the day of, of Solomon. So Solomon says you are ensuring the fact that your family will have enough nutritious milk to drink and meat to eat, because once the goat gives its milk, and if you need meat on the table, now the milk is already on the table, but if you need meat on the table, the goat itself could serve as meat. And if you had a whole lot of goats, you were assured of having meat on the table and milk on the table. Teach, Pastor, I'm doing the best I can. So the wise man Solomon says, look, you can also exchange, you can barter goats and make a profit to enable you to buy more land, to buy more goats, if you will, to buy more sheep, if you will. So your finances will grow. So your finances will grow. Let's look quickly and review and give an overview of verses 23 through 27. It's simple. He starts in 23, listen carefully, and shares with us what happens when one gives up being diligent. He introduces it to us in verse 23 and then illustrates it for us in verse 24. Then he transitions in verse 25 to no longer talk about what happens when one gives up being diligent. He shows us with crystal clarity what happens when one goes on being diligent. And he says to us, look at the diligence fields, look at the diligence farms, and look at the diligence food, food. So here, Solomon shares with us in no uncertain terms the importance of being diligent and the danger of not being diligent. I see that my time is far spent. It's far better to have God and not need Him than to need God and not have Him. If you walk with God, my God will walk with you. We apologize for the interruption and we apologize for the longevity of this study for tonight, but we look forward to picking up again in chapter 28 when we meet again, if it be the Lord's will. God bless you. We love you much. May God be with you.